This
You've been
conference will
nominated.
now be recorded.
You have been nominated as the 14th best charity to work for. So I applaud the team for that. But I really love the statement that sits at the top of your frames on this, that quality management starts and ends with people. And I would put it to you that just about all aspects of services business actually endorses that statement as well. So let's explore what can be done to help this strategic statement when it comes to the subject of well-being in the workplace. But also I'd put it to you that whilst you're number 14, could you actually do it better and become number 1? So I'm going to cover off the agenda. I'm going to cover off this evening is covering these 3 core points really. That I'm trying to explain to business why the subject of mental well-being and stress in the workplace isn't just an HR problem. I'm going to talk to you about some of the myths of impact and also some practical ideas as to the solutions that are out there to help alleviate the situation. One of the first things we need to do as business leaders is try and understand the language in the boardroom. I've often had HR people coming up to me as the MD asking me to spend money on well-being initiatives. And as ruthless as it might sound, the senior leadership team, with regards to the well-being and management of their people, they're very interested in things that align to these core drivers. And for me, this pretty much sums up where the whole subject needs to orientate itself. For example, where am I losing productivity that I'm not aware of? Where am I exposed to risk that I'm not aware of that actually might lead to reputational damage or even litigation through burnout? And what can I do to deepen my culture to have a queue of people outside the front door when I turn on the recruitment tab? Now, as mercenary as that may seem, unfortunately, that's the language in the boardroom. And when we're trying to tackle serious subjects like this one, we need to align that language to these core drivers. And I think if you start there, you stand a really good chance of getting buy-in from the top. And I suppose I've looked at this from the point of view of an MD as to how I would want to be exposed to the subject of change with these particular headings in mind and understand how we measure some form of return on investment. There's a chap by the name of Dr. Paul Litchfield, who for many years was the Chief Medical Officer of BT. And he puts it to all of us really that well-being is the core driver of productivity, which in turn delivers your profits. And in his opinion, that all starts with good jobs and good work. So good work, if people are enjoying good work, it will automatically improve their well-being. That lifts motivation, helps drive purpose and overall personal fitness in terms of attitude to the job. And in turn, that improves well-being, and it's a really positive cycle. And when you're in a good place there, you will get your innovation and creativity, which many organisations, certainly as we emerge from the COVID situation, will be seeking to achieve. It's where you get your high engagement, and it's a real positive circle of activity. But we all know only too well, when we go on the flip side, that poor work leads to poor well-being. That can lead to accidents and litigation and so on, and eventually, if prolonged, will lead to absenteeism. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the word presenteeism, but it's a term that's very prevalent in the mental health space. And just for those of you that don't quite understand, it's very difficult when you're talking on these forums because I can't see everybody to know whether they're nodding in agreement whether they know it or not. So I'm just going to assume that I need to explain. So absenteeism, I think everybody's a term familiar with, is when you're off from work or somebody's off from work, they're absent. It's as straightforward as that, and they're not functioning in their normal role. Presenteeism is the term we would give to people who are at work, they're attending work, but they're not completely there because they're distracted through, in this instance, high stress. And it's a subject that's dear to the heart of many HR folk out there, is how on earth do you measure the scale of presenteeism? Because unless people are willing to be honest about how they're feeling or what's impacting their daily lives, you're never going to really know. But it's a subject that is really being tapped into and what I'm going to try and address tonight, really. So the good news is positive activity generates and leads to more positive outcomes, and we all know what the flip side happens there. But the core thinking here is that good well-being is driven by good work. And that for me is all about job design, supported by organisational design, culture and leadership, of course. And our work, and we're an analytics company, our work actually supports our data we've collected supports that first point really. Something like 25% of the people that we surveyed so far in the workplace are not able to be themselves at work. So it is a really big issue in today's workplace, and I'll go on to explore that a little bit more. But when we're talking about mental health in the workplace, it's a huge, huge subject. There's actually some positive sides to all of it, which I wasn't particularly going to go into tonight, but often it's been cited as a negative. But I just want to unpack the conversation a little bit and talk about it, and if you can bear with me, put it into these three core headings really. Yes, there are people in the workplace with clinical mental health problems, which might be anxiety and depression, but most of us are not clinicians and wouldn't know necessarily what we can do to help. But if we're aware of the scale of the problems, we can put targeted support in place. Outside of that, we're into the world of stress. And stress, if prolonged for too long, will actually lead to clinical mental health problems, typically anxiety and depression actually. And stress has two sources. It can originate from the home, which I refer to as domestic here. And it can also, unless we as employers are directly causing that problem, there's not a lot you can do about it, but if you're aware of the scale of the problems, you can put targeted support in place. And that's where many organisations are, for example, looking at financial well-being and training. But the subject I concentrate on is a subject of work-related stress, and I put it to the leadership teams that is the area that they're in control of, and if they understood the scale of the problems, without a doubt, you can effect change and do something really, really positive about it all. So the gauntlet I throw down to leadership is it's actually certainly within their powers to attend to this. And I'd just like to pick up on this chat. I don't know if anybody on the call listens to LBC in the mornings with Nick Ferrari, but yesterday morning there's a top psychologist from Ireland called Dr. Harry Barry. I don't know if you've come across him. If you haven't, I really recommend his books. I find them very thought-provoking, particularly if anybody's got phobia problems and things like that. I've actually had personal conversations with him. Very, very thought-provoking man, actually, and very good on the stage, by the way, if you're thinking of other ideas for topics in the future. But he talks about the 3 stages of mental health. The first one is people naturally start from being healthy emotionally. We're in a good place. We're functioning well. When we become distressed, we eventually become mentally distressed, and that impairs our judgment and our ability to perform, to top notch. And too much stress and load from there on will eventually lead to mental ill health, which is where people will then start disappearing from the workplace, or even going next stage and taking organisations to court and all that sort of stuff. The vast majority, he cites, the vast majority of mental health issues in the workplace is not due to severe mental illness. And if you're listening to the news at all on the subject, actually the way it's discussed, it seems to be cited as the biggest issue. And our work certainly supports this. But actually it's by no means the biggest issue at all. But severe mental illness comes as a result of 2 or 3 of the bullets below. People suffering from own crisis at home, toxic stress in the workplace or burnout, high anxiety caused by a number of different things, and mild to moderate depression. So that they are the sources of key issues for people that are still at work suffering from stress. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind that when we're talking about poor mental health at work, the people who are severely ill are actually off work or absent. We're now trying to help the people who are in work who are suffering from some problems. And the big elephant in the room, in my opinion, is work-related stress. But when we talk about stress, there's 2 sides to it. We need to understand that within an environment, we have stress exposure and stress responses, and this is the way the psychologists will talk. And I have an advisory board of psychologists advising me. I'm not a psychologist, by the way, although I love the subject. But stress exposure is what's going on inside the organisation that's giving rise for people to being exposed to stressful situations, and that might be high workloads, it might be bullying and harassment as an extreme. That doesn't mean to say that every person will respond to that stressor in the same way. So what we need to do is understand the stress exposures. They're the things organisations can do something about. But we also need to understand how badly people are responding to those stressful situations. So the two don't necessarily go hand in hand. You need to understand both. Otherwise, there's a danger you're going to be fixing the wrong stuff. So what are the primary causes of stress? And the icons on the left-hand side here are the typical sources in the home, typically money, relationships, health, and these days personal time. And I would imagine for many people who are working from home, the sort of boundaries between work and home are very, very blurred at the moment. Often find myself looking at emails very late at night, but you know, that is the nature of our world these days a little bit, but they are the primary sources of domestic stress, as I would refer to them as. And on the right-hand side, the list here is the primary sources of work-related stress. And I'm sure when you read that list, none of them are to do with mental health conditions. They are just what I would consider business leadership items that really ought to be attended to. And the psychologists tell you, would say, and as I said earlier, I've got a board of psychologists, and these are the factors that they tell me are the biggest issues affecting people's stress levels in the workplace. And it ranges from, I don't understand what my job is, to at one end, to bullying and harassment at the other end. So the message I'm trying to get across here is this isn't scientific psychology stuff. This is actually business as usual. That actually, if we attend to some of these issues, and I can't count the number of organisations that have abandoned appraisal processes, and it really does affect sometimes for many different types of people the way they perform. So I just wanted to sort of get across that message that this isn't rocket science. This is stuff absolutely in the control of an organisation. I don't know whether anybody's read the book or I've had a look at the research from Ferdinand Fornes. But quite a number of years ago now, he cited 16 reasons why employees don't do what they're supposed to do. So that's often the chant of senior leadership. You know, why can't the team just do what I ask them to do? But when you actually analyse that list, it very much dovetails actually with the list and sources of stress. And actually, you can almost correlate and attach them to each one of the headings that I've shared with you just now. So actually, the two things are very hand in hand. And actually, you know, employees aren't doing what's expected of them because actually they're suffering all the things that's preventing them from doing it. So if time and attention was put together to change that, you could have a monumental difference. And actually, maybe the teams will start doing what you expect them to do on a regular basis, and everybody gets into that positive circle of activity. I'd just like to share with you where businesses act with mental health in the workplace today. There's a chap by the name of Peter Kelly, Dr. Peter Kelly. He's the chief psychologist of the Health and Safety Exec. I've often heard him talk at conferences, and if you're on the line, Peter, I'm sorry I stole these words from you, but I really think it sets the scene very well. He talks about the 3 levels of intervention. The tertiary level is providing support to stressed out staff. And that's where there's been a lot of focus with mental health first aid training. And without a doubt, it's got a role to play. I don't know whether people have experienced it in their own working environments. It's without a doubt, it's got a role to play, but it's not going to fix the problem. But it's certainly a useful resource for people to go to if they're seeking some form of assistance and perhaps being signposted to the resources available within the organisation. The secondary level of interventions is providing enhanced management, stress management, resilience training to the individuals who have been exposed to stress. And there's an awful lot of apps out there, sometimes implemented at corporate levels with companies like Unmind, Headspace and so on, but there's also the apps that you can download for your own self-benefit from Calm and organisations like that. Again, very useful for meditation and things like that. But again, it's not going to solve the core problem, which is what I'm citing as the subject of work-related stress. And that is tackling the problem at source. And that's where we've spent the last 4 years digging deep to try and understand the root causes. And if you get to grips with the root cause, I'm very much a cause and effect person. I suppose that's the nature of my mathematical background and technology experience. But I'm a firm believer if you tackle the problem at source, you can actually make things a lot better faster, and you actually won't need so much of the 2 above. There's often conversation with the HR profession about organisational energy these days. Most HR strategies are centred on the concept that productivity comes from knowledge plus skills plus motivation. And there's a fourth one that's eluded me for now. But actually, one of the top HR professionals I know was who used to be the global head of HR for Unilever worldwide, often talks about this subject of organisational energy. So, and I think it's such a core point these days. And he's articulated, I don't think it's necessarily his own work, but he's articulated into these 4 pillars really. Organisational energy is so key for getting a highly engaged workforce. At the top of that pyramid is the subject of the topic of purpose, and that's organisational purpose, which many organisations should be referring to as their strategy. But purpose isn't just about organisational strategy, it's about how do I fit within that strategy. What's my role? And a very good example of that was Kennedy back in the early 60s, where he set a 10-year mission that by the end of the decade, he wanted a man on the moon. Everybody in that organisation knew what their purpose was and probably how they're fitted. And of course, Elon Musk has just done it again earlier this week or last week with the brilliant news of his program. Then we're into sort of 3 core well-being pillars. At the bottom of that list is the subject of physical well-being. Many organisations have been implementing physical well-being programs for their teams for many years now, cycle to work schemes, and I guess that's going to grow in volume as people are more nervous of travelling on public transport. But actually there is a very real psychological benefit for being physically fit. The major focus of activity at the moment is on the subject of mental well-being. That's where a lot of noise is, and that's where I was talking earlier about the apps and the support that's available. And that's where the focus has very much been over the last few years. But the psychologists will tell you your biggest bang for your buck is in the subject of emotional intelligence. And that's all about how do we actually get the employees themselves into a far happier state. And that subject of emotional intelligence is where I've personally invested my own time over the last 20 years in trying to understand people better and their differing needs. We're not all the same. Different types of people need different support and different styles of communication, different training methods and all the rest of it. And we really need as leaders to understand those different types and the impact we can have on them. I actually personally did a company turnaround. I was invited at the beginning of 2012 by an investor chairman on a technology business that had been fading around for a few years. Had achieved incredible client coverage, but was not able to scale. And when I actually took a look at the problem, this subject was so rooted to their problems, it was obvious from my point of view what needed to happen to make it change. And as I said, I'm in technology, and techies need to be left alone. If you've got sales guys running them ragged, trying to sort of get them supported with the next deal, guess what happens? They get disrupted on their ability to deliver, and then they go up behind on their timescales. So there are ways of dealing with these situations. That is what I mean by being more emotionally intelligent. Huge, huge subject.
Paul, sorry, it's John.
Yeah.
Paul, I just thought it might be we had a few questions come through. I thought maybe have a little pause and just on your last point. Yeah, have a drink. Andrew Kinsey's raised a point just regarding, is it the role of the business to solve some of these problems in terms of, unless you're a mental health doctor, surely you cannot, is his point. So maybe there's a bit of a challenge there into how far you can go.
Well, that's the point I was making earlier. Actually, the root cause of the biggest volume of issues in the workplace isn't anything to do with mental health and psychologists. Most organisations seem to be on the bandwagon of training mental health first aiders and actually buying in organisational psychologists. I would argue you don't actually need either if you get to the root cause of issues. And if you were to look at our data, actually the bulk of the problems are to do with high workloads, which usually translates to workload balancing, and actually just poor descriptions of work. And if you intermingle that with actually understanding the needs of the different types of people better, actually it's not a mental issue at all. It's actually a business, I would argue, it's a business as usual problem.
So it's poor management, training and education.
inadequate leadership, in my words. Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else, or shall I carry on?
Carry on, or I'll review more questions.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
A very valid question, and it's one of the things I'm trying to get across, really. I'm not a psychologist, but I actually did successfully turn that company around by dealing, actually, when I look back at my track record, I was brought on board to turn that company around and sell it, which I achieved, and exited the business with some good value by the end of 2016. So I walked my own talk on this stuff, but it was done manually, and I reckon had I had some of the tools that I've built now, I actually would have saved myself 2 years of effort. And that was nothing to do with mental agility. Sorry, it's everything to do with mental agility. It's nothing to do with the mental psychology side of it. It's the product, actually, of your work that achieves that. I can't count. This slide is all about trying to get across that quite often I'm in the boardroom and senior directors say to me, actually, I like a bit of stress, don't I? And I argue, in fact, I probably might have said that myself many years ago. I'm a keen yachtsman, by the way, and that picture on the left-hand side probably look dated now, looking at the nature of the kit they're wearing. But actually, I used to do this stuff. I don't these days. I have a more leisurely cruising life these days. But I used to be in offshore racing, and believe me, you don't want stressed out people operating in close quarter racing like that. A simple mistake could be catastrophic and lead to very expensive, let alone possible damage and loss to life. So I argue actually that you don't want stress. What you want is competitive pressure. And competitive pressure is good. If I've run meaty sales teams in my past, and actually you need some competitive pressure in there, and that's where they get the positive juices flowing. Too much pressure actually becomes stressful, and that creates all the wrong hormones, and will eventually, if it's left for too long, will eventually lead to poor and possibly significant health problems. So I just want to get across that stress is not good. I often hear people saying that actually stress without de-stress. I actually think and suggest to you all that actually let's get rid of the word stress altogether. Stress is bad. Let's focus on competitive pressure. We all need a bit of competitive pressure to up our game. We certainly don't want too much pressure that converts to stress. 2 years ago, over 2 years ago now, the Health and Safety Exec issued these numbers. And basically at the time, as a result of some of their own work, they were forecasting that on average across the UK working population, that the average business was losing 24 working days per year to stressful, caused by issues caused by stress, absenteeism caused by stress, which is in effect a loss of productivity of 10.6% per person. The unquantifiable number actually was the subject of presenteeism, which is, as I said earlier, is when people are in the workplace but not there completely because they're heavily distracted, caused by the stresses they're coping with. And the suggestion was, and the forecast was, that was running at 1.5 times the cost of absenteeism. I can actually tell you, as a direct result of the data we've collected over the last 2 or 3 years, that number is actually bang on. Organisations are on average losing between 20 to 30% of productivity caused by presenteeism, and I think and there is a direct loss of productivity and exposing people to risk. So I think it's very real numbers. And of course, we all know what happens when people are very stressed. They just could disappear, and quite often these days might even go to a lawyer. In fact, you takes me on to the next point. I don't know if anybody on the call has actually been following some events that went on with France Telecom last year, but in the 2000s, the CEO and 6 of his fellow colleagues, CEOs pictured here, took France Telecom on a major restructuring program that they shed about 20,000 staff in a pretty ruthless, merciless manner. And I don't know, there is a call I put out to organisations right now who may have to go through some serious restructuring caused by the COVID problem. Just be a little bit careful how you go about it. You know, people are still people, and there is a duty of care required. What actually happened in France Telecom, it was cited that the actions of the senior leadership led to 35 suicides as a direct consequence of that downsizing, which is a shocking number. And the families that brought a collective action together and sued the organisation and the senior directors for effectively corporate manslaughter. I can tell you now they were found guilty. Actually, it was a year-long trial that ended in December. They were found guilty, and in January they were all sentenced to a term in jail. And I believe they're still inside at the moment, with some pretty meaty, and the corporation was signed find some pretty meaty money as well. So it's okay. France is a little bit different to the UK, but I think it's a sign of the times of the change in landscape that senior directors do need to be a bit more diligent and have a duty of care in when they're affecting serious change. And also, I can personally tell you, I've seen a growing rise of employment lawyers who are operating on the no-win, no-fee structure. Are you being stressed at work by your boss? I've seen a number of firms grow quite significantly over the last few years. And you know what? Pretty much they're winning most of the time. You go to an employer, to a lawyer, and tell them you're being stressed out, you can't work anymore. Unless the organisation can really demonstrate they've taken core action or preventative action, they're going to lose pretty much every time at the moment. And you won't believe the claims that are being paid out and hidden under the carpet because organisations are too embarrassed to let that be known. And the final point on this slide actually is that poor mental health is now listed as a discrimination. And I don't know if everybody's aware, but as soon as something is classified as discrimination, it's open to claims. Sorry, it's recognised as a disability, which means it's open to discrimination claims. So that ramps up, if you like, the seriousness of the subject, really. So I'll just pause again, Jonathan. Is there any burning questions at the moment, or shall I carry on?
Yeah, there's a few that's come through. One is just what techniques could actually be used to tackle some of the primary causes of mental health, where by their very nature the roles are highly pressured. Some examples were given in terms of like NHS, A&E, that kind of stuff, where it's high pressure. What kind of interventions could be made there?
Well, we're talking about interventions is a massive subject, and of course you're talking about the health professionals that are coping with the extreme challenges of the COVID situation and the risk to life. At the end of the day, that's a very difficult one for me to answer, because I am not a health clinician, but I would imagine the types of people, this is where emotional intelligence in the leadership really ought to go. The sorts of people they're dependent on to administer that health care are not the people that can carry don't carry high resilience levels of stress resilience. The people who are usually top of the organisation, driving the organisation, I'll probably cite myself as one, I don't mind taking a few risks. In fact, that's what I've been doing for 25 years. I've put my entire livelihood on the line several times now. I'm on my 4th startup. I don't mind doing that, mind you, as I've got longer in the tooth. I've kind of a bit more used to doing it, I suppose, and accept the risks that come with it. But you'll see it on the TV right now. The scientists are all risk averse. All the scientists are telling you, no, it's too early, you shouldn't be doing it. Why? Because they're risk averse. All right. And it's a very different mentality to somebody, for me, I'd be saying, I think we should move a bit quicker because I'm more worried about the economy than the risk to life. Now that's my, the different risk appetites, shall I say. So the sorts of people that typically make up the health professions need a different type of support to the people in leadership. So I think where I'd start with that one is inject some emotional intelligence into the leadership that's trying to look after them so they understand. And there's going to be two core types, which I can talk a little bit about later, and actually then put in the direct support they need. And I would imagine PTSD must be starting to rise. I've done a lot of personal support work to some members of the military over the years who have come to the end of their term, and high stress in the military environment. In fact, I think I saw a report on it recently where the NHS, the senior NHS professionals, the clinicians that is demanding the same sort of support that the military get when they've been in battle. So I think there's a lot more that should be done, but I don't want to get too political on the subject. So my immediate answer, off the cuff response, when I reflect on what I've just said, Jonathan, is emotional intelligence would be a very good place to start.
Okay. And I suppose at one other question before I let you carry on, at the other end of the scale, when a lot of us are doing increased home working, what do you think the new kind of issues are going to be in terms of the stresses that we're going to potentially suffer from?
Again, I'm going to cite the same thing actually, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. Let's just deal with the subject of extroverts. If you're an extrovert, generally you like being with people. If you're at home on your own and have been for 12 weeks now, you're probably climbing the wall a little bit, you know, or you're spending a lot of time on calls and all that sort of stuff. You know, the different types of people have different needs. Now, the techies probably really enjoying being left alone so they can quietly get on with the work without the usual interruptions. So, you know, so I think, again, it's emotional intelligence, really. And I think right now, organizations really need to get a grip on what's affecting the different types of people they've got as they, you know, because I suspect people carry on working from home for quite a long period of time. In fact, I think it's going to become a restructured of the new norm in a way. The new norm is the latest term, isn't it, really? But I'm talking to a lot of organizations. Actually, they had to move 90,000 people into the home in a week, and they achieved it. And you know what? Why come back? You know, actually, so the biggest question is, actually, is it as productive as it should be? That needs to be measured. And actually, what's the impact and shift that it has happened on the different types of people? So again, it's emotional intelligence backed by real data.
Yep. Okay. I'll let you carry on, Paul, if you want.
Yeah, thank you. So realistically, you know, there's a couple of questions in there about what can you realistically do about it. And I really like this slide because most organisations don't spend any time. They automatically assume they know what needs fixing. And guess what? You end up with this type of scenario where you start bashing away and then wonder after an enormous amount of money and effort that not a lot's changed. And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen that as well. So where do you start? First of all, you need some form of strategic plan that ties in with the corporate goals. You can't go embarking off on any period of change unless it's marrying itself and in line with corporate objectives. And too often I see well-being plans put in place that just seem to ignore that, and it's more on the social good rather than competitive advantage, perhaps. The other thing you need to do, is, and I started off by saying that, is you need to understand what needs fixing. That's all about data. Go and understand the core issue. And I would imagine, I'm talking to a bunch of converted people here, to actually demonstrate quality, you've got to have some form of measure. So I think you start with data and plans, align the key stakeholders, and then the final piece of the jigsaw is understand the needs of the different types of people, and that will then feed into some form of transformation program. And if you're talking about the sort of numbers I've been talking about, that an organization that's turning over, I don't know, 20 million, a 10% shift on that is an awful lot of money. All right, so that's the sort of real impact that we can have, and I think organisations now more than ever need to understand that. So I've kind of in danger of stealing my own thunder earlier, actually, with this subject, personality profiling. Why is it important? But I thought I'd just give myself, in case I didn't get a breather, I'll inject a bit of an opportunity for a breather for myself. I just want to show you how clever our minds are. A number of you might have seen this slide. You might even be using it in your own workplaces, but I'll just give you 2 seconds when I have a sip of water to read that. So for those of you that haven't quite got there, it says the phenomenal power of the human mind. According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. So why is that of interest and important? It just demonstrates how very quickly we make automatic decisions and process things actually without even really realizing it. I would imagine for most people, and again, it's very difficult in these sorts of forums to actually gain any form of response from the audience, because I haven't got an audience, so it's kind of weird, really. But I would imagine many of you got that straight away. And I think the key thing here is we're very capable of judging and making core decisions without even realizing where they've come from. So in our work, we actually use and embed something called DISC. DISC is a psychometric tool that's been around a long time now. And I love it. I've been working with it for 20 years, actually, and I've ignored it to my own peril. I've used it for recruitment, team building, and goodness knows what else. And it also creates a very simple language. I'll go on to briefly describe it in a minute. But for us, for every individual, it does show behavioural preference style. So this is where I'm coming from in understanding people. When you perform a DISC profile on somebody, you can actually get an impact view of how their working environment is actually affecting them, whether they are able to be themselves at work, which quite often can give you job mismatches. You can also use this stuff, by the way, for profiling jobs as well as people. And you can also, it also gives you a clue if you got what I got, the word I've used there is syndromes. That's probably an extreme word actually, but it can certainly identify particular leadership challenges. You know, particularly leaders who might be of a stop-start orientation or even a procrastination. And it's when you understand some of those issues, they're quite easy to fix actually. So that can be very useful if you can see a poor performing team and you've got a leader with one of those challenges. I'll use that as a very minor example. But for groups, and I've used this to great effect on the company I took on to turn around, the first thing I did in my 90 days is run a profiling session with my new leadership team. There's about 8 of us in the room. And by the end of the day, I knew an awful lot more about them. It gave me the blueprint with what I was working with. I also knew who shouldn't even be in the room. So it kind of gave me tremendous insight, but it also gave them tremendous insights about each other. Team intolerances improved as an automatic result. So because everybody thought that Joe in the corner was being awkward, actually he just needed to be left alone, and actually he was very functional in his job. So better understanding of people automatically lifts tolerances, which in turn automatically lifts perception of product, I would argue, productivity. So that's a sort of part of the journey with emotional intelligence, really. I just thought I'd give a rapid, it's such a huge subject, but I thought you might find it valuable because I suspect the nature of the audience likes a bit more detail. But before we start, I just want to get across 4 core points. There's no personality type is better than another. Everyone has, each has its own strengths. Without a doubt, variety is an asset. You would not want a whole army of people of one type. That wouldn't work either. And every company absolutely does need a mix, okay? But DISC, and the reason I like DISC is because it maps things into a simple plane. Into a simple matrix, a Boston matrix. On one plane, we're looking at people who are proactive versus reactive. And hopefully that language is fairly straightforward for people. So a proactive person is somebody that initiates, and a reactive person is somebody who waits to be invited. Right? And there are, without a doubt, very different classifications of people. And it doesn't mean to say people won't get on and do things, it's just a natural tendency. And what we're doing is we're marrying that with the terms introvert and extrovert. And the introvert and extrovert are very much Latin terms, and intro is turn inwards and extra is turn outwards. When I actually invite, quite often when I'm running a workshop, I'll invite people to give me a view as to what they think the differences between the two are. And what I'll often be given is a description of their behaviors that people see, which is actually slightly wrong because, believe it or not, I'm an introvert. Here I am talking online. I'm quite happy to stand up and speak at conferences to an awful lot of people. People sort of naturally think an introvert is somebody that will sit in the corner with the headphones on, you know, doing techie stuff or geeky stuff or something like that. That's just not true. Introversion and extroversion is where do you get your source of energy? So an introvert turns inwards, they like to be on their own and just recharge that way. An extrovert will want to recharge by being with people. So there's some fundamental differences there that is worth trying to understand. As I said, this is a huge, huge subject. So where DISC comes from is each one of the boxes has a dominant style. Every single one of us will have a dominant style. So a proactive introvert is what we might call a high D person. That's somebody who enjoys a challenge, drives through tasks more than people. Whereas a proactive extrovert is, again, somebody who's proactive, but they tend to drive through people. So they're very much a more people-orientated business leader. It doesn't mean to say that the two don't intermingle, because I've got qualities in both, but my dominant style, me personally, for example, my dominant style is a high D. And those that know me well, there might be 1 or 2 on the call, will probably be smiling at that, because I'm a no-nonsense merchant, but I can be quite nice with it. A reactive extrovert stands for steadfastness, steadiness, perhaps reliable, and will quite often be the sorts of, quite often make very good trainers or HR staff, or perhaps good Samaritan, good ears to listen to. So they're good with people, but they're good listeners with it. I'm not to say that the proactive ones aren't good listeners, but a reactive extrovert is a very steady individual. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. Beg your pardon. And high C people are what we would call conformants. So they are reactive introverts. They love data and process. So they will tend to be the people that love accuracy. So I guess there might be a few on this call as well. But as I started off by saying, it's not there's no right or wrong in this. It's just understanding the dominant style. And if you were to draw an equilateral triangle and you wrote the letters DISC, that would be pretty much the workforce distribution in most organisations, and our data tends to support that. So I'll come on to why all this is important in a little bit, but there's some key words about the differences between the core types. You know, introverts tend to be things people, data and fact, love data and facts. Extroverts tend to be people's people. They also need to be liked. You know, you need to stroke an extrovert more than an introvert. Proactive, take initiatives. Reactive, need to be invited. And I just want to leave on this slide, and there's such a lot behind this, but just leave one thought for you, that if an individual is confronted with a serious business problem, right, or an issue at work that's going to be quite stressful, a proactive person, a naturally proactive person, will start looking at that issue and try and find a way of resolving it. And a reactive person will tend to sweat on it rather than, it will worry them more. So just by understanding that difference, that if you know you've got reactive people in your team and they're hitting problems, you need to be more readily available to support. All right. So just so naturally, proactive people have a higher resilience than reactive people. Some of our work talks about heat maps, and this is an example of a heat map. And I just wanted to show this to exemplify the point I've just been making. Our data can be sliced and diced across a whole range of dimensions, but on the left-hand side here, you've got the DISC, and what you've got in the chart is intensities of different stresses, and you can see there that the S's and C's, which are the more reactive types, are generally suffering more than the other two. And that's so important when trying to understand where your big wins are and what you can do to help people. And you need to marry that with all sorts of other information as well. I mentioned earlier the difference between stress response and stress exposure. It's all very well measuring stress exposure, but you need to marry it with how stressed actually people are. In this example, in the middle there, you've got senior manager director are running at 18% exposure, much higher exposure actually than the others, which probably isn't a surprise to many directors or senior leaders in the room. However, they are generally of a high resilience, and this particular example, the impact it's having on them is negligible compared to the impact on the other types of people. So you can see here that the stress exposure to the people managers, probably because it's been fended off by the senior guys, for the people managers running at 10%, whereas the impact it's having on them is running nearer to 20 to 25%. So you need to dig into the issues affecting people to understand how to affect positive change. One of the core things I wanted to just get across is this subject of people not being themselves at work. I ran a survey for the benefit of an HR magazine nearly 18 months ago now, and 200 or 300 HR professionals actually responded. And on average, 22% of them were not themselves at work. That means they were changing their behavior to accommodate their job, which is caused by one of two things. It's caused by that they were wrongly selected, and people didn't actually understand the requirements of the job who were making the hiring process or trying to make the hiring process work. And that's such an important thing, and probably not uncommon in the world of HR actually, because I think most HR people are recruited because of their bright and bubbly personalities to you know, are very good with people, but are often put into a job that's more about defending the organization with process and procedure rather than actually dealing with the thing they're probably very good at. So suffice to say that nearly 25% of people would modifying their behavior to be at job, and the secondary reason behind that is actually lack of understanding of what their job is, no job description or acceptable job description, so they were trying to interpret what their boss expects of them. And if you spend time trying to keep your boss happy, you might well be off the mark as well. So what the key number in this though is that 23% of the lost productivity for that group of people was that point alone. So again, this is supporting the theme of emotion intelligence. The other thing we need to do, and we can do this, of course, I'm about to say this, but you can create a return on, having got your data together like that, you can create a return on investment model, which people like me need to have. You know, if we're going to affect change. This was on a cohort of 100 people, by the way, nearly £1 million worth in 1 year of lost productivity caused by these issues. The organisation, my client in the question, picked off the areas in pink and made it their strategic programme of change for the preceding next year. And that accounted for nearly £700,000 worth. And of course, that's recurring lost revenue or lost productivity. So you need to be able to get the message in the boardroom. You need this sort of data to get the buy-in from the FD and the CEO. I'll tell you that now. Also, it's very helpful, I've mentioned earlier, to understand the real scale of anxiety and depression. This stuff really feeds, again, this is extracts from our own systems. This stuff feeds the support mechanisms you need to put in place. And we also have some self-validation that actually can determine how, you know, so we're collecting a lot of data, but you also need to have it self-validating as well with picking up on symptoms. So we've got a lot of clinical psychology stuff embedded in our technology as well. A typical journey, I think most organizations these days are engagement surveyed out, and trust of these things has been declining for many a year. Actually, I'm hearing it quite a lot, and the reason trust is dropping and participation rates are possibly dropping is because nothing actually really happens or no real change is affected. So organizations need to be really careful when you're digging into this subject that people really want to participate, because if you're not going to convey trust, then actually you're going to go nowhere. And my mantra is, you know, trust is only built by doing what you say you're going to do. So you need to reset your communications and reset the planning. I mentioned strategic planning earlier. That is so fundamental to the communications and why you're doing it and what happens thereon. And from there, you can go on a complete cycle and continuously measure. Organizations say, where do you start? Well, I think you need to, you know, you might have a part of the business which has got known issues. I would always argue you should have a comparison, perhaps a good part of the business versus a poor performing part of the business. Without data can be very interesting, and for us data people it's always interesting, but actually for many people you start to glaze over and it can create more questions than answers. The best way of resolving that is to have some good comparisons. So we would argue at least 2 divisions or a whole company wide to get the organizational variances, particularly multi-locations. And then come back and measure. So what you need is the ability to affect change and then come back and see how that change has been affected. And that has to be done in a consistent manner, otherwise you're barking up the wrong tree. The other thing we're doing is enhancing and expanding that journey into actually, why don't you measure people as they join the organization and establish what state they're in as they come in. State's the wrong word, but I hope you get my meaning. There's bound to be organizational changes along the way, so why don't you track those as well? And actually, as people depart, understand a little bit more about why they're leaving and actually feed that back into the process as well and into the constant monitoring so that you can continually improve the sort of the overall well-being of your teams. You know, it's often cited that a person joins an organization but leaves a manager. And I think this type of process will really help organizations understand where it can go wrong. And actually, if somebody joins the organization in a positive state and eventually leaves to a very negative state, hopefully you can establish why. That brings me neatly to the end of my scripted talk. I hope you found that really, really interesting. I'm very much open to questions or challenges. Over to you, Jonathan.
Great, thank you, Paul. That's wonderful. Yeah, well, we've had lots of questions and comments. Not that you've seen them, but they've been piling in the chat as you've been talking along. So that's great. I've got some great questions actually. So I'll go through some of these. An interesting one's come from Jack, who's on the London branch, in relation to clients and customers. I mean, for quality, customer focus is what we're all about. But he says, I think another form of stress is very common is the type arising from client engagement. It should be recognized by both parties as poor communications and a lack of clarity can create stresses both ways. But quite often the client is favored and excused. How do we balance this and support our teams when faced with stressful clients?
Yeah, very good question. And wouldn't life be simpler without clients? I always say life would be so much simpler without clients and staff. Yes, one of the core stresses is actually being accountable for things that then you're dependent on that are outside your direct sphere of control. And in client relationships, that is often the case. You know, particularly if you are responsible for delivering a major program or consultancy change or whatever it is, and the client, you know, I often, when I took on that company on the turnaround, the chairman told me at the moment, he said, I've got a simple mantra: when the client says jump, you ask how high. I could not disagree with that point more, actually. Long gone are the days, in my opinion, of this client-supplier, you know, do as I tell you to do mentality. You know, to affect real change these days, it's a partnership. And my advice to you is realign that client relationship into a partnership. And, you know, the senior step from the start, I believe success is planned for. And I really counsel you to dig in deep. If you were to just, I don't know how many people are involved in that, but if you were to just pick off that point amongst the team, how many people are stressed because of the lack of control that they're dependent on stuff coming in? It would help if your leadership is resistant for you having and inviting those sorts of conversations. The data alone will tell you the need, but actually I can tell you from pragmatic, as I'm used to having those I won't engage in a supplier client transactional relationship. The only relationships I want are strategic, and that is a partnership approach. You've got an issue, I've got something that will help, and together we'll make it better. Hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, no, certainly it's that emotional intelligence again, isn't it? On both sides, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So there's an educational role there, perhaps, sometimes in what you do, in terms of bringing the different stakeholders.
I think so. I think you know, you're certainly the more junior people that are responsible, and need necessarily be more junior people. Many of the different types of people that are charged with looking after those sorts of relationships, but might also be non-confrontational. Right? This is where you need to understand. If you're a non-confrontational person put into that as a natural style, if you're put into that situation and the client barks at you, it might not even be a bark that the client thinks they're barking at you. It might be just what they would consider a normal request. If you're of a non-confrontational disposition, it's going to worry you, and it will stress you out in its own right. Whereas people like me don't mind confrontation. So to me, this is how do we work together to make it, I don't want to be stressed out by you. So you are stressing me out. So what can we do to make this whole thing better? Let's work together. So, and just having those conversations can be elevating for all of those involved. But if you're a non-confrontational disposition, you're never going to start it, actually. So if you've got people who are responsible for those sorts of links, who are of that orientation, you need senior leadership support to go and help resolve that problem.
Okay, great. We've got another question from Andrew Kinsey, who I work with and know well, who's very involved in mental health and helping our organisation. But Andrew's raised the point about diet, and good diet is correlated with mental health. Do you think employers and organisations have a role to play, e.g., not encouraging a drinking culture, providing healthier food? You know, that's made me think about all the the simple things that organisations leadership can do without the kind of detailed analysis and all that good stuff. The simple things that we can do to actually just improve people's well-being, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a wonderful, I think it's called SHED. It's sleep, hydration, exercise, and diet are the core. So to bank the word SHED, if you focus on those 4 core things, you will improve your mental well-being no end. And I think organisations do have a I started work in the late 70s, and I worked for one of the top software houses for over a decade in the mid 80s to mid 90s. And the drinking, you had to be part of that drinking culture. And if you didn't, you were driven to be feeling quite small. And it took a personal toll on my personal life in the end. And when I reflect back, it didn't make me a very nice person either, because guess what? You're getting drunk all the time and trying to big it up in those environments. And I ended up working from home for the best part of a decade, and I hated it when I look back. So I think today's world has shifted. I hear the words that cycling is the new golf, for example. But should you be forced into doing that as well? So I think organisations do have a social responsibility for I think it's probably more about encouraging, putting in schemes of activities in place. I see some great employers that are doing quite a lot, so educate people on what's available, not necessarily direct them what they should or shouldn't be doing. I think we're in a world of more freedom of choice, but to help people understand the impact. It always amazes me, people talk about, they want a healthy workforce, but what are they really doing to encouraging it? And if you're forcing people to work long hours, high pressure time zone, timetables and all that sort of stuff, just exacerbates the situation, and naturally you end up on a poor diet because there isn't any time to do what you need to do, i.e. cook fresh food and take the time out to sleep. So I think absolutely right, Andrew. Yes, organisations should be encouraged.
I like that acronym. I'll remember that. I've got another one which is HALT, H-A-L-T, which is hungry, angry, lonely, tired. If I'm any of those things, then it's probably time to do something about it. But yeah, certainly. There's a role for the individual, encouraging the individual to explore their own way. Exactly. I suppose.
I think so. Yeah, and I know I've seen organisations that wax lyrical about the interventions they put in place to help their stressed out staff. Right, and what they're talking about is, and it might be a choir or something like that. Well, I just argue, well, why spend the energy on building a choir to help you stress out stuff? Why don't you just deal with the root cause that's causing it in the first place? And I'll come back to it actually, the psychologist would tell you that the big elephant in the room, and which is the unspoken thing really, is the workplace stress being caused by the culture and the leadership. And if you attend to that, you can eradicate the problem. And if you combine that with being a bit more socially, what's the word I'm looking for, enlightening with the conversation we just had, Jonathan, then actually, do you know what? You'll end up in a very good place.
Yep.
In my opinion.
Yep. Okay. We've had another question regarding if we had occupational health within a company, an exit medical would be instigated and then insightful. Oh, Maury, right? Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's not. This must have been going on for a long time. We've had occupational health, we've had health, safety, and well-being around for a long time. And do you think that's it's failed to address some of the fundamental issues?
I do. I mean, let's not confuse health and safety, okay? Because there's been massive work done over the last few decades on improving health and safety and reducing accidents in the workplace. But what we're talking about here is what can organisations do to improve the mental fitness and the agility of people, and that actually falls under subject of health, out of health and safety, and is gaining prominence now by the HSE themselves. I think organisations, I often hear, organisations, big organisations are put in EAPs, employee assistance programs, quite often run by their insurance company, which might be one of the big names like AXA, Aviva, and so on. And the take up on those is very low. Why? Because they don't trust it. You're not going to talk about your personal issues to an organisation if you think that the data is going to come straight back to the employer. So there's a very vicious circle of lack of trust, and there's some frightening statistics about how poorly people trust their employers. So I think trust is the big issue there. And anything that you do, I don't know how many people watch the series Billionaire, but there is the talk about organisations need their own Wendy. Now that's got a role to play in terms of sales type performance improvement and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of helping people internally, I think people are going to be very reluctant, really. So that's where mental health first aiders can have a role to play, because they can be a bit impartial. They can give you signposting to what is available and perhaps improve that trust for the facilities available. But actually, most people seek real help outside the organisation because they don't want that data coming or that information coming back to their employers. They don't want to be, they're worried that their employer will take a dim view. And I actually can ask, I'll tell you a frightening conversation I had with a senior MD actually of a media organisation, they'll remain nameless, where the MD said to me, so you'll be able to tell me the 20% of people who are highly stressed? And I went, yes. He said, great, so I'll be able to fire them. And I went, pardon? I didn't, I'm just, you cannot be serious. And that really was, that was a serious. So that's an extreme, if you like, as an example about why people might be frightened of talking to that manager about why they're having issues. So, and he wouldn't be able to put anything in place that they would value. Right? So they would naturally go to external sources because of that confidentiality thing.
Yep.
And the flip side of all that, Jonathan, is actually many organisations are worried about taking a deep dive because they're frightened of the risks and liabilities they might surface as a result. And of course, as a director, if you're aware of a liability, you have to take action on it. Otherwise, you have a potential serious liability on your hands. Now, my response to that generally is you've got the liabilities already, you just don't know it. And actually to not know about them is negligent. So, you know, in our high quality world, talking to a bunch of quality professionals, it's far better to understand where you're at, and then you can put in measures to sort it out.
Yeah, moral duty, one would argue.
Correct.
Okay, we've just gone past 7 o'clock actually, but I think we've got time for a couple more questions if people want to hang on. Got one from Vince who says, Paul, do you think this topic is properly considered at the school level? And is it being properly considered in management education these days?
That's a very good question, and something I'm very live on. Actually, we actually ran a pilot project that was just coming to a conclusion as we were all locked down for a private school, just as a pilot, actually, to see, because we often hear about how stressed out the teachers are, and believe me, they are. And I'd never be one, and I think I've got high resilience levels. Mind you, that probably my type of person wouldn't be very good at putting up with noisy kids running around all over the place either. So you know, it does take a different type of person. But we've run the project. I can tell you now that without a doubt, the work we're doing will have a significant, and it's very similar stuff actually. And most teachers are of a reactive, extroverty type of personality. Okay, so and they don't like change. All right, and in the education world, it's constantly changing. And I'll just use that as a very, very simple example. And when you've got a changing environment, the people that don't like change need to be handled and nurtured through it. You can't just implement change. And I think there's such little attention given to that subject, and it features quite strongly even in big organisations. But yes, I couldn't agree more, Vince. The world of education desperately needs better support in this. There's a lot of activity going on now with educating children about the subject of mental health, so they're more aware of things that might affect them. Part of our work, and I think our work is too early for the kids themselves, but part of our work actually educates us individuals about where we might personally be affected by a stressful situation, how we might be, the sorts of things that might affect us, and how our own behaviour could affect others, and as part of that emotional intelligence angle again. But I think talking to psychologists, it's just a little bit too early to dig into the children with that, but without a doubt, helping the teachers at that level would, I think, have a significant impact. And we're rather hoping to start a big program of activity, although I think we'll let the schools get on with just dealing with the situation they've got on their hands right now, because they're having to implement huge change just to cope with kids and social distancing, which is is an even bigger problem than the one I described that I would have earlier. So, but yes, Finch, without a doubt, it needs to be attended to.
Great. Okay, thanks, Paul. We've been going for an hour and 5, and I think you'll probably need a drink of water now and a rest. So perhaps we'll bring it to a close. There are lots of other questions on the chat, and perhaps what I'll do after is download those and send them on to you, and you can always get in touch with people that raise those and carry on with the conversations.
If you want to share my details, if you share my email, Jonathan, I'm very happy for people to make contact and pose questions. Very happy with that.
That's great. Many thanks, Paul. It's been an excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. Really stimulating lots of thought amongst people who have joined us. So thank you so much for that. Definitely, I think about how we develop management systems and how we think about operational processes, and we think about resources, and we're very methodical about how we systemize things. And the human being is at the very heart of organizations, and we've got to make sure that we give them the tools, and we give them the quality tools to remain as human beings, the most valuable asset an organization's got, and healthy when at work. And it's a really fascinating area, and one that needs to develop, in my opinion. So thank you so much. It's been great.
Pleasure.
I'll just make an announcement about our next event, if anybody wants to join us on June the 17th. Very different subject. Sewerage, actually. It's the Tideway team will be doing a presentation about their work on the Tideway system, the New London sewer under the Thames, and that's all about collaboration, though. So it's related in a way. The collaboration that they've been getting involved with their suppliers there has been a real learning from them in terms of driving improvement in their performance. So if you want to join that event, please just have a look on CQI website. That's on June the 17th, and that's a lunchtime event, so you might be able to join that whilst you're eating your butties. But from myself and the London branch, thank you very much again, Paul, for your presentation. Thanks to everybody joining us. You'll be getting an email regarding some feedback probably tomorrow. Would really value it if you could complete that and give us some thoughts about future events. And again, if anybody's interested in joining the London committee, we've got a couple of vacancies. You can get involved in running events like this or presenting them yourself. So thank you very much, and see you all again soon. Cheers now.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.